The day I walked into my parents' backyard barbecue wearing my hospital lanyard and scrubs, my father looked at me the way he always did, like I was slightly late to something and slightly underdressed for it. I had driven 4 hours from Ottawa. I had been on shift the night before. I had not slept more than 5 hours in the past 2 days. But I was there, standing on my parents' back deck in Mississauga, with a Tim Hortons cup going cold in my hand. And my father was already looking past me toward the driveway, where my brother-in-law had just pulled up in a new F-150. "There he is," my father said, and walked right past me. That was the summer I turned 34. I had been a hospitalist physician for 3 years by then. I worked out of the Civic campus, covered internal medicine, saw somewhere between 15 and 20 patients a day. I had published 2 papers. I had just been asked to join a research committee looking at health outcomes for Black patients in the Ontario system. None of that was something my father mentioned at barbecues. What he mentioned at barbecues was my brother-in-law's contracting business, which had expanded to a second crew that spring. "Expanding in this economy," my father said, clapping him on the back. "That takes guts." My sister, Tara, she's 3 years older than me, married him right out of college. She caught my eye across the yard and gave me a small, apologetic smile. She'd been giving me that smile for about a decade. I used to find it comforting. By that summer, it had started to feel like the smile you give someone when you both know nothing is going to change. My mother was at the grill, turning chicken. She waved me over, and I went, and she held my face in both hands for a moment the way she always did when she hadn't seen me in a while. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired. Eat something." That was my mother's answer to most things. Eat something, sleep, come home more. She was not a woman of many words when it came to the harder conversations. But she had always been the one who showed up, who drove to Ottawa when I had my wisdom teeth out in second year, who mailed me meal prep containers every month during residency, who called every Sunday without fail even when I didn't pick up. She was the one who knew, long before anyone else, what I was becoming. She just didn't always say it out loud. I should tell you about my father, because he is not a villain. I want to be clear about that, because for years I tried to make him one in my head, and it never quite fit. He came to Canada from Trinidad in 1987, 22 years old, with 1 suitcase and a cousin's address in Brampton. He worked construction for 7 years before he got his electrician's certification, and then he worked as a licensed electrician for 20 more. And then he started his own small company, and then he retired. He built something from nothing, in a country that was not always welcoming to him, and he did it through sheer stubbornness and a refusal to ask for help that was both his greatest strength and, for his children, exhausting. He believed in visible things, tangible things, a truck in the driveway, a business with employees, a house that was paid off. He respected those things because he understood them, because he had built them himself, because they were proof, real, irrefutable proof, that a man had made something of his time. What he did not entirely understand was medicine, not in the way he needed to take it seriously as a measure of achievement. To him, a doctor was like a teacher or a lawyer, a person who worked inside, who used words, who didn't come home with their hands dirty. He respected it in the abstract. But he didn't feel it the way he felt a crew showing up at 6 in the morning, the way he felt a contract signed. He had wanted me to go into business. When I chose pre-med at U of T, he said, "You sure?" in the tone that meant he thought I wasn't. When I got into medical school, he said, "Good," and went back to the hockey game. When I matched to internal medicine, he said he wasn't sure what that was exactly. My sister's husband had started as one of my father's apprentices. My father had trained him, mentored him, helped him get his first commercial contract. The pride he felt in that was genuine and enormous, and I understood it. I just didn't know what to do with the fact that my father had never, not once, looked at me with that same particular kind of pride. The thing about becoming a doctor in Canada is that it takes so long that by the time you're actually practicing, the people who love you have adjusted to a version of you that doesn't quite exist anymore. They got used to you being a student, then a resident, then a fellow. They got used to calling you on Sunday nights and hearing exhaustion in your voice and asking, "How much longer?" And somewhere in that decade of training, they stopped tracking what you were actually doing, because the details were too specific and the timeline was too long, and it was easier to just say, "She's still in school," and leave it at that. My father, when he introduced me at family gatherings, said, "She's a doctor." Not what kind, not where, just, "She's a doctor." Like it was a single thing, a category, a label that covered the whole enterprise without requiring any further investigation. My brother-in-law, when he introduced me, said, "She works at the Civic, right? Internal medicine?" That's serious work. He had looked it up once, years ago, after a patient he knew had been admitted with a pulmonary embolism, and he had come to me with questions, and I had answered them, and he had never forgotten that I knew what I was talking about. I always liked him more than I probably should have, given everything. But my father didn't ask questions about medicine. He asked about my apartment, my car, whether I was seeing anyone, when I was going to buy instead of rent. He asked about the things he could evaluate on his own terms. The other things, the committee work, the research, the patients I thought about on the drive home, those things lived in a part of my life that he had never really visited. The day that changed things didn't feel, at first, like a day that would change anything. It was a Saturday in October, the Thanksgiving weekend, and my parents were hosting the whole extended family, aunts and uncles and cousins and my grandmother on my father's side, who was 91 and still sharp, and who was the only person in my family who consistently asked me specific questions about my work and listened to the answers. I had come the night before and slept in my old bedroom with the same burgundy curtains. And in the morning I had gone for a run along the Credit River before anyone else was awake. I liked those mornings. The house before my father was in it felt different, lighter somehow, more like the version of home I kept in my memory. My aunt and uncle arrived around noon. My uncle had a hip replacement earlier that year, and he was moving well, and he wanted to talk about it. Who did the surgery, how long recovery took, what physiotherapy had been like. I sat with him at the kitchen table for 20 minutes while my mother made tea, and I answered his questions, and he said, "You know, having a doctor in the family. It's not nothing, it's really not nothing." My father was in the living room. I don't know if he heard that. I thought about it later, whether he had. The afternoon was fine, crowded and warm and full of the particular noise of a Caribbean-Canadian family gathering. Competing music preferences, arguments about football, children running between the adults' legs, someone always in the kitchen, someone always at the grill. My grandmother sat in the good chair by the window and held court, and I sat near her for a while. And she told me about her Dr. Brampton, who she liked, and about a show she'd been watching, and about the winter she spent in Port of Spain in 1971, which I'd heard 3 times but didn't mind hearing again. It was late afternoon when the call came. I didn't hear it at first because I was outside, helping clear plates. My mother came to the back door and called my name in a specific way. Not the way she called me for food or to come look at something, but in the focused, quiet way she had when something was actually wrong. I went inside. My uncle was on the kitchen floor. He had been standing at the counter getting a glass of water and he had gone down, and by the time I got to him he was unresponsive. My aunt was beside him, both hands over her mouth, not making any sound. My cousin was frozen in the doorway. 2 of the younger kids were somewhere behind me and I said, sharply to whoever was closest, "Get the kids out of here," and someone did. I checked his pulse. I checked his airway. I told my mother to call 911 and to tell them suspected cardiac event, adult male, approximately 67 years old, and to stay on the line. I started CPR. I don't remember the next several minutes the way I remember most things. I remember them the way I remember any resuscitation, as a series of tasks, each one following the next, the thinking happening somewhere underneath the doing. I was counting compressions. I was talking to my aunt, not about what was happening but just talking, so she had a voice to anchor to. I was listening for the siren. It came in about 8 minutes, which felt like much longer. The paramedics came through the front door. Someone had unlocked it, and I stood up and I gave them the handoff the way I always did, clinical and fast. Onset, duration, what I'd observed, what I'd done, pulse status when they arrived. One of them looked at me and said, "You're a physician, hospitalist," I said. "Civic campus. Good work," he said, and they took over. My uncle survived. He had a significant cardiac event, the kind that, without intervention in the first minutes, would almost certainly have killed him. The paramedic told my aunt, later, at the hospital that early CPR had made the difference. He was in the ICU for 4 days, and then on a cardiac ward for another week, and then he went home to his house in Burlington, where he has since installed a defibrillator in the front hallway, and where he calls me every few weeks to report on his recovery in more detail than is strictly necessary, but which I don't mind at all. I didn't stay at the hospital that night. I rode with my aunt in the front of her daughter's car to the emergency department, and I waited until I knew he was stable, and I spoke briefly with the attending, who was a colleague I recognized from a conference, and then I drove back to my parents' house, because there were still people there who needed somewhere to be. The house was quiet when I got back. The party had dissolved. My grandmother was still in her chair. My mother was in the kitchen. The food was put away. My father was sitting at the dining room table. He looked up when I came in, and something in his face was different, not dramatically different, not transformed, just slightly open in a way it wasn't usually, like a door that was not yet open but was no longer locked. He said, "The paramedic called." I didn't know what that meant at first. I sat down across from him. He said, "He called your mother's phone to give us an update on Dwight," and he said, my father stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table. He said if you hadn't been there, hadn't done what you did in the first minutes, Dwight would not have made it. I didn't say anything. He said, "He called you." He said, "Doctor." My father said my last name, my full professional name, the one on my hospital ID, the one on my research papers. He said it carefully, like he was reading it. He said, "Doctor." He said, "You gave a textbook handoff." He said he wanted us to know. I looked at my father. He was not a man who cried. In 34 years I had seen him cry twice. Once when his mother called to say his brother had died. Once at my grandmother's 80th birthday, briefly, when she danced. But his eyes were bright, right then, in a way I hadn't seen before. He said, "I didn't know. I didn't." He stopped again. "I didn't understand what you do." And I thought about what to say to that. I thought about the years of it. The barbecues, the introductions, the truck in the driveway, the way he walked past me toward my brother-in-law. I thought about the Sunday calls with my mother, the meal prep containers, the burgundy curtains. I thought about residencies and the exhaustion that lived in my body for years, and the patients I still thought about, and the ones I had lost and the ones I would never forget. I thought about all of it, and what I said was, "I know, Dad." Because what else was there? He was not a villain. He was a man who understood the world in one language, and I had spent my whole life becoming fluent in another. And that night, for the first time, we were briefly in the same room with the same vocabulary, and it was because a paramedic had called to say my name. My grandmother, when I passed through the living room to say goodnight, took my hand and held it for a long moment. "I always knew," she said. "From when you were small. I always knew you were going to do something real. You never told me that." "Yes, I did," she said. "You just weren't listening." Maybe she was right. Maybe there were things being said all along that I wasn't hearing. In the same way my father wasn't hearing the things I was saying. Maybe love that doesn't know how to name itself is still love, even when it looks like nothing at all. I drove back to Ottawa the next morning. The highway was clear. The sky was that particular October blue that only exists in Ontario for about 2 weeks a year, and I had a coffee in the radio and 4 hours to sit with everything. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to say that clearly, because this is not that kind of story, the kind where the recognition finally comes, and it fixes everything, where the daughter gets her moment and the father is transformed, and everyone understands each other from that day forward. Life doesn't work that way. My father still tells people I'm a doctor without the specifics. He still talks about my brother-in-law's second crew at barbecues. Some things don't change all the way, but something shifted. Small and real and permanent, the way a bone heals. Not back to what it was before it broke, but into something that holds. He called me that Wednesday. Not my mother. Him, which had happened maybe a dozen times in my adult life and usually for logistical reasons. He asked how I was. And then he said, very carefully, "That committee you mentioned, the research one. What is that exactly?" And I told him. And he listened. That was enough. It was not everything, but it was enough. And I have learned in the years since that enough is not nothing. Enough is sometimes the whole point. I belong to the life I built. I built it in early mornings and late nights, and a decade of training and 1,000 decisions that no one in my family fully saw me make. I built it in the language my father doesn't speak, and that will always be true. But there was one October afternoon in Mississauga, when that language was the only one that mattered, when everything I had learned and practiced and carried finally came to something that my father could feel in his chest. Not as pride exactly, but as understanding, as seeing, and I'll take that, I really will.